A warm welcome to Professor DC, where literature comes alive. In today's session, we are diving into the eerie and captivating world of The Cookie Lady by Philip K. Dick. This is your go to place for deep, engaging, and thought provoking exploration of classic and contemporary works. Whether you're a student eager to excel, a lifelong learner with a passion for stories, or just curious about hidden layers of your favorite text, you are in the right place. Together, we'll break down the complex themes, unravel intricate narratives, and discover the beauty of words in a way that are easy to understand and impossible to forget. So hit that subscribe button and let's dive into the world of literature where every story, like the Cookie Lady, opens a new horizons of knowledge and insight. Let's begin this story together. Where you going, Bubber? Ernie Mills shouted from across the street, fixing paper for his route. This opening line sets the scene in a small neighborhood. Ernie is casually asking Bubber, a boy, where he's headed. The use of shouted suggests a sense of casual familiarity, perhaps even a hint of teasing. Notice how Ernie is occupied with his paper route, which is typical activity for kids in such neighborhood. This adds to the everyday, almost mundane setting. No place, Bubber Searle said. Bubber's response, no place, might seem dismissive, but it also hints at secrecy. It's a classic line that suggests Bubber doesn't want to share his plans, possibly because they are personal or because he anticipates teasing or judgment. This immediately sparks curiosity. Why is he being secretive? You going to see your lady friend? Ernie laughed and laughed. What do you go visit that old lady for? Let us in on it. Ernie's teasing becomes more direct here. By referring to Mrs. Drew as Bubber's lady friend, Ernie is mocking Bubber, suggesting there's something unusual or even humorous about Bubber's visit to an old lady. This repetition of laughed and laughed emphasizes Ernie's amusement, and it paints a picture of how kids might find such an interaction strange or funny. But to us as readers, it also makes us wonder, what's really going on? Why does Bubber visit this old lady? Bubber went on. He turned the corner and went down Elm Street. Already he could see the house at the end of the street, set back a little on the lot. The front of the house was overgrown with weeds, old dry weeds that rustled and chattered in wind. The house itself was a little grey box, shabby and unpainted, the porch steps sagging. There was an old, weather beaten rocking chair on the porch with a torn piece of cloth hanging over it. Now, friends, this description of the house is crucial. The house is personified, it's described as if it has its own personality, one that's eerie and neglected. The old, dry weeds that rustled and chattered in the wind creates an unsettling atmosphere. It's as if the house itself is whispering secrets. This grey box of houses is not just physical description but a metaphor for loneliness and decay. The house reflects Mrs. Drew's state of being, shabby, neglected, and isolated. Bubber went up the walk. As he started up the rickety steps, he took a deep breath. He could smell it, the wonderful warm smell, and his mouth began to water. His heart thudding with anticipation, Bubber turned the handle of the bell. The bell grated rustily on the other side of the door. There was silence for a time, then the sounds of someone stirring. Now, friends, here we see the stark contrast. Despite the eerie setting, Bubber is drawn to the house by the wonderful warm smell of cookies. His mouth waters, a very human reaction, showing that despite the setting, something appealing exists inside. Notice how the house, though decaying, still holds something alive and warm inside. The bell grated rustily, this phrase indicates age, neglect, and this reinforces the theme of decay. However, the anticipation Bubber feels creates a suspenseful tone as if something significant is about to happen. Mrs. Drew opened the door. She was very old, a little dried up old lady, like the weeds that grew along the front of the house. She smiled down at Bubber, holding the door wide for him to come in. When Mrs. Drew is introduced, she immediately is compared to the weeds that grew along the front of the house. Now, this simile connects her directly to the environment. Both are old, withered, and neglected. Yet she smiles and welcomes Bubber, indicating a warmth and kindness that contrasts with her physical appearance. This juxtaposition creates a complex character who, despite her frailty, finds joy in Bubber's visits. "You're just in time," she said. "Come on inside, Bernard. You're just in time. They're just now ready." Notice how Mrs. Drew calls Bubber by his formal name, Bernard. This formality adds a touch of old fashioned charm to her character. The repetition of just in time heightens the sense of anticipation. It's as if everything revolves around this moment. Bubber arriving precisely the right time for cookies. This gives the visit almost a ritualistic significance. Bubber went to the kitchen door and looked in. He could see them resting on a big blue plate on top of the stove. Cookies, a plate of warm, fresh cookies right out of the oven. Cookies with nuts and raisins in them. Now, friends, this description here is rich with sensory details. Bubber sees, he smells, and likely even imagines the taste of these cookies. The big blue plate is a simple detail, yet it adds a homely, comforting image to the scene. These cookies are not just food, they symbolize comfort, care, and perhaps a maternal affection that Bubber craves. "How do they look?" Mrs. Drew said. She rustled past him into the kitchen. "And maybe some cold milk? And maybe some cold milk too. You like cold milk with them." She got the milk pitcher from the window box on the back porch. Then she poured a glass of milk for him and set some of the cookies on a small plate. "Let's go into the living room," she said. Mrs. Drew's attentiveness to Bubber's likes, offering cold milk with cookies, shows her desire to please him, almost like a grandmother doting on her grandchild. Her actions are nurturing, but there's also something sad about the eagerness. It suggests she has a little else to look forward to in her life, making Bubber's visit her highlight. Bubber nodded. Mrs. Drew carried the milk and the cookies in and set them on the arm of the couch. Then she sat down in her own chair, watching Bubber plop himself down by the plate and begin to help himself. Now, this scene here, friends, is both cozy and a little sad. Bubber plops down. It says Bubber plops down, a word that implies carelessness or maybe just comfort, while Mrs. Drew watches him. Her joy comes not from the cookies themselves but from watching Bubber enjoy them. This underscores her loneliness. She lives vicariously through Bubber's simple pleasure. Next lines: Bubber ate greedily as usual, intent on cookies, silent except for chewing sounds. Mrs. Drew waited patiently until the boy had finished, and his already ample sides bulged that much more. When Bubber was done with the plate, he glanced towards the kitchen again at the rest of the cookies on the stove. Now, friends, Bubber's greed for the cookies is emphasized here. His ample side suggests he's a chubby boy, but the focus on his greediness hints at something deeper. Perhaps Bubber is filling a void with his food. Mrs. Drew's patience and observation indicate how much she realizes that she absolutely loves to see Bubber eat, and she relishes this routine, even if it's just watching Bubber eat. Wouldn't you like to wait until for the rest? Mrs. Drew said. Now, Mrs. Drew's suggestion to wait shows she wants to prolong the visit. The cookies are her way of keeping Bubber around. There's a subtle sadness here. She doesn't want to rush through the only joy she gets in her life. All right, Bubber agreed. Bubber's agreement is nonchalant, showing that he doesn't fully grasp Mrs. Drew's need for his company. For him, it's just about the cookies. How were they? Fine. Mrs. Drew is seeking validation, a sign that she has succeeded in pleasing Bubber. His simple response, fine, might be disappointing in its brevity, but it's enough for her. That's good. She leaned back in her chair. Well, what did you do today in school? How did it go? Here, Mrs. Drew tries to engage Bubber in conversation, perhaps to feel a connection beyond just feeding him. She wants to be a part of his life, even if it's just through small talk about school. It's a typical question, but coming from Mrs. Drew, it feels more like a desperate attempt to extend his visit. All right. Bubber's brief answer again shows his disinterest in conversation. He is there for the cookies, not for companionship. The little old lady watched the boy look restlessly around the room. Bernard, she said presently, won't you stay and talk to me for a while? He had some books on his lap, some school books. Why don't you read me from your books? You know, I don't see too well anymore, and it's a comfort to me to be read to. Here, Mrs. Drew's loneliness becomes even more apparent. Her plea for Bubber to stay and read to her reveals how much she craves human interaction. The books are an excuse to keep him there, to hear a voice in her quiet, solitary world. Can I have the rest of the cookies after? Bubber's response shows that he's willing to stay, but only if there's something in it for him. The cookies are his currency for the time spent. Of course, Mrs. Drew's response is immediate and eager, showing how desperately she wants Bubber to stay. She is willing to give up what little she has, those precious cookies, just for a bit more time with him. It's a poignant moment that underscores her deep loneliness. Bubber moved over towards her to the end of the couch. He opened his books: World Geography, Principles of Arithmetic, How It Is Speller. Which one do you want? Bubber's casual presentation of his school books contrasts sharply with Mrs. Drew's eagerness. To him, this is just a routine task, something that might even be a bit boring. He doesn't understand the emotional weight this moment carries for Mrs. Drew. She hesitated. The geography? Mrs. Drew's hesitation reveals her uncertainty, perhaps even a desire to choose something that might seem more interesting or that she has a particular fondness for. Geography, with its vast landscape and distant places, might offer her an escape from the small, confining world she lives in. Bubber opened the big blue book at random. Peru. Peru is bounded on the north by Ecuador and Colombia, on the south by Chile, and on the east by Brazil and Bolivia. Peru is divided into three main sections. These are: first, now friends, as Bubber begins to read, we get a sense of the mundane nature of what he's reading. It's just a geography lesson. Facts about distant places that might mean a little to him. But for Mrs. Drew, this is more than just information. It's a connection to the world outside, a world she can only access through the words Bubber reads to her. The little old lady watched him read, his fat cheeks wobbling as he read, holding his finger next to the line. She was silent, watching him, studying the boy intently as he read, drinking in each frown of concentration, every motion of his arms and hands. She relaxed, letting herself sink back in her chair. He was very close to her, only a little way off. There was only the table lamp between them. How nice it was to have him come. He had been coming for over a month. Now, ever since the day she had been sitting on the porch and seen him go by, and thought to call him, pointing to the cookies by her rocker. Now, friends, this passage is rich with emotion. Mrs. Drew is not just listening to Bubber's reading, she is absorbing every detail of his presence. The fat cheeks wobbling and frown of concentration are endearing details that show how deeply she cares for him, how much she enjoys his company, how much joy she derives from these small observations. The history of the relationship is revealed here. She first lured him in with cookies, a gesture that was born out of loneliness and the need for her companionship. The detail that he has been coming for over a month indicates that this ritual has become a vital part of her life. Why had she done it? She did not know. She had been alone so long that she found herself saying strange things and doing strange things. She saw so few people only when she went down to the store or mailman came with a pension check or the garbage man. Let me reread these lines. Why had she done it? She did not know. She had been alone so long that she found herself saying strange things and doing strange things. She saw so few people only when she went down to the store or the mailman came with her pension check or the garbage man. Now, friends, Mrs. Drew's reflection on her actions reveal her own confusion and sadness. She doesn't fully understand why she called out Bubber that day, which highlights how deep her loneliness runs. Her interaction with the world are limited to basic transactional exchange with store clerks, mailmen, and garbage men, people who don't truly engage with her as a person. This stark isolation has led her to act in a way she doesn't entirely comprehend. Next lines. The boy's voice droned on. She was comfortable, peaceful, and relaxed. The little old lady closed her eyes and folded her hands in her lap. And as she sat dozing and listening, something began to happen. Pay attention, friends. The little old lady was beginning to change, her grave wrinkles and lines dimming away. As she sat in the chair, she was growing younger, the thin, fragile body filling out with youth again. The gray hair thickened and darkened, color coming to the wispy strands. Her arms filled too, the mottled flesh turning a rich hue as it had been once many years before. Now, friends, the reason I ask you to pay attention is this is the turning point of the story where reality begins to blur with fantasy. As Mrs. Drew listens to Bubber and as he reads on, she experiences a transformation, not just emotionally, but physically. Her wrinkles and grey hair fade, replaced by vibrant youth she once had. This magical transformation symbolizes the rejuvenating power of Bubber's presence. He represents life, youth, and vitality, all of which Mrs. Drew has lost over time. The description is vivid, making us feel the warmth and richness of the renewal. It's as if the presence of youth really breathes life back into her. Next lines. Mrs. Drew breathed deeply, not opening her eyes. She could feel something happening, but she did not know just what. Something was going on. She could feel it, and it was good. But what it was, she did not exactly know. It had happened before, almost every time the boy came and sat by her. Especially of late, she had moved the chair nearer to the couch. Especially of late, especially of late, since she had moved her chair nearer to the couch. She took a deep breath. How good it felt! The warm fullness, a breath of warmth inside her cold body for the first time in years. Now, friends, this passage reinforces the idea that Babur's visits are more than just a break from loneliness. They are a source of life itself for Mrs. Drew. She doesn't fully understand the change that's happening, but she embraces it. The warm fullness she feels contrasts with the cold body she has been living in. It's a metaphor for her emotional and physical isolation. The proximity of her chair to the couch symbolizes her increasing need to be close to Bubber, to soak up his vitality. Next line. In her chair, a little old lady had become a dark haired matron of perhaps 30, a woman with full cheeks and plump arms and legs. Her lips were red again, her neck even a little too fleshy, as it had been once in the long forgotten past. Friends, Mrs. Drew's transformation is now complete. She has become a woman in her prime, full of life and vitality. This image of her contrasts sharply with the earlier description of her as a little dried up old lady. The long forgotten past suggests that this version of herself is something she has not experienced in many, many years, making the transformation all the more poignant. It's as if Bubber's presence has brought her back to life, both physically and emotionally. Next line. Suddenly, the reading stopped. Bubber put down his book and stood up. I have to go, he said. Can I take the rest of the cookies with me? Just as suddenly as the transformation began, it's interrupted. Bubber's abruptness is jarring. He needs to leave, and this cuts off the magic that has been happening. His request for more cookies is almost cruel in its innocence. He is unaware of the profound impact he has on Mrs. Drew, reducing their relationship to a simple transaction. Next line. She blinked, rousing herself. The boy was in the kitchen, filling his pockets with cookies. He went across the living room to the door. Mrs. Drew stood up. All at once, the warmth left her. She felt tired and very dry. She caught her breath, breathing quickly. She looked down at her hands, wrinkled, thin. As Bubber prepares to leave, the transformation reverses. The warmth and youth that had filled Mrs. Drew drain away, leaving her feeling more tired and dry than before. The return of her wrinkles and thinness symbolizes the return of her reality, one of isolation, aging, and loneliness. The fleeting nature of transformation underscores the temporary reprieve Bubber provides, making his departure all the more heartbreaking for her. Oh, she murmured. Tears blurred her eyes. It was gone, gone again as soon as he moves away, or moved away. She tottered to the mirror above the mantel and looked at herself. Old faded eyes stared back, eyes deep set in withered face. Gone, all gone, as soon as the boy had left her side. Friends, Mrs. Drew's sorrow is palpable. The transformation was brief and its disappearance leaving her feeling even more desolate than before. The mirror becomes a symbol for harsh reality, reflecting the truth that she can't escape her old age and loneliness. The old faded eyes are direct contrast to the youthful vibrancy she momentarily had, making the loss even more tragic. I'll see you later, Bubber said. Please, she whispered. Please come back again. Will you come back? Sure. Bubber said listlessly. He pushed the door open. Goodbye. He went down the steps. In this exchange, Mrs. Drew's desperation is clear. She pleads Bubber to return, clinging to the hope that she can experience that fleeting joy and youth again. Bubber's response, sure, is indifferent, reflecting his lack of understanding of what his visits mean to her. His listlessness highlights the emotional distance between them. What's just a visit for Cookie to him is life itself to her. In a moment, she heard his shoes against the sidewalk. He was gone. This is a simple sentence, but it marks the finality of Bubber's departure. The sound of his shoes fading away symbolizes the fading of Mrs. Drew's brief return to youth and happiness. The silence that follows is a stark reminder of her solitude. Bubber, you come in here. May Searle stood angrily on the porch. You get in here and sit down at the table. Here we see Bubber's home environment for the first time, and it is marked differently from the atmosphere at Mrs. Drew's house. May Searle, Bubber's mother, is introduced with a tone of authority and irritation. Her anger contrasts sharply with the warmth and care Mrs. Drew shows Bubber. This difference highlights the conflicting environments Bubber navigates, one of strict discipline at home and another of indulgence and care with Mrs. Drew. All right. Bubber came slowly up onto the porch, pushing inside the house. Bubber's slow movement and word pushing suggests reluctance. He's not eager to go back inside his own home because of the possibility of the lacking comfort and warmth he finds at Mrs. Drew's house. Now, this reluctance further emphasizes the contrast between the two environments. What's the matter with you? She caught his arm. Where have you been? Are you sick? May Searle's question, or some people pronounce it Surley, May Searle's questions are rapid and accusatory, showing her concern but also her frustration. The way she caught his arm indicates a lack of gentleness, as if she's more concerned with his obedience than with his well being. Her question, are you sick? Might seem caring, but it's more about trying to understand why Bubber looks the way he does, tired and worn out, than about genuine concern. I'm tired. Bubber rubbed his forehead. Now, friends, Bubber's response is simple but telling. His tiredness is more than physical. It's a reflection of the draining effects of his visits to Mrs. Drew. Rubbing his forehead suggests he's trying to soothe himself to ease the fatigue and perhaps emotional toll these visits take on him, though he likely doesn't fully understand it. His father came through the living room with the newspaper in his undershirt. What's the matter? He said. Here, Bubber's father is introduced. The image of him in his undershirt with newspaper gives a casual, perhaps careless impression. His question, what's the matter, is delivered in a way that suggests he's more curious than concerned, and this adds to the sense that Bubber doesn't have a deeply nurturing environment at home. Look at him, May Searle said, all worn out. What have you been doing, Bubber? May's focus is on Bubber's appearance, how worn out he looks. This reinforces the idea that his visits to Mrs. Drew are taking physical toll on him. Her repeated questioning shows her frustration, but there's also a hint of confusion as she doesn't understand the true reason behind Bubber's exhaustion. He's been visiting that old lady, Ralph Searle said. Can't you tell he's always washed out after he's been visiting her? What do you go there for, Bub? What goes on? Ralph's comment revealed that this isn't the first time Bubber has returned home exhausted after Mrs. Drew's home visit. The phrase washed out suggests complete fatigue, as if Bubber is drained of energy. Ralph's question, what do you go there for, carries a tone of suspicion and confusion. He doesn't understand the connection between Bubber and Mrs. Drew and he's trying to make sense of it in a practical, perhaps even cynical way. She gives him cookies, May said. You know how he is about things to eat. He'll do anything for a plate of cookies. May's explanation reduces the entire relationship between Babur and Mrs. Drew to simple transaction. Cookies in exchange for Babur's company. Her comment, he'll do anything for a plate of cookies, paints Babur as easily manipulated, driven by his appetite. This dismisses the deeper emotional connection that might be at play, making the whole situation seem trivial. Bub, his father said, listen to me. I don't want you hanging around that crazy old lady anymore. Do you hear me? I don't care how many cookies she gives you. You come home too tired. No more of that. You hear me? Ralph's directive is harsh and final. He refers to Mrs. Drew as that crazy old lady, showing a complete lack of empathy or understanding for her situation. His main concern is Babur's well being, but he expresses it in a way that dismisses any potential positive aspects of Babur's visits. The repetition, do you hear me, and no more of that, emphasizes his determination to put an end to these visits. Babur looked down at the floor, leaning against the door. His heart beat heavily, labored. I told I'd come back, he muttered. Babur's reaction is one of guilt and resignation. He physically and emotionally is exhausted. His heart beat heavily, labored, suggests the strain these visits have put on him. He promised to Mrs. Drew, I told I'd come back, is muttered quietly, indicating that he feels conflicted. He doesn't want to break his promise, but he is also weighed down by his parents' order. You can go once more, May said, going into the dining room, but only once more. Tell her you won't be able to come back again, though. You make sure you tell her nice. Now go upstairs and get washed up. May's compromise is harsh but practical. She allows Babur one more visit, but with a condition that he ends it permanently. Her instruction to make sure you tell her nice suggests that she understands this might be difficult for Mrs. Drew, even if she fully doesn't grasp the depth of Mrs. Drew's loneliness. Now, friends, this moment is significant because it's a planned goodbye that will likely be difficult for both Babur and Mrs. Drew. After dinner, better have him lie down, Ralph said, looking up the stairs, watching Babur climb slowly, his hands on the banister. He shook his head. I don't like it, he murmured. I don't want him to go there anymore. There's something strange about that lady, that crazy old lady. Now, Ralph's unease grows here. He's concerned and he says there's something strange about that old lady. It hints at the mystery surrounding Mrs. Drew. He can sense that something unusual is happening, even if it doesn't understand it. His instinct is to protect Babur from whatever this strangeness might be, but his approach lacks compassion or understanding for Mrs. Drew's situation. Well, it'll be the last time, May said. May's statement is final, echoing the inevitability of the coming separation between Babur and Mrs. Drew. There's a sense of closure here, but it is tinged with sadness. The finality of the last time suggests that something important, though not fully understood by Babur or his parents, is coming to an end. Next line. Wednesday was warm and sunny. Babur strode along, his hands in his pocket. He stopped in front of McQueen's drugstore for a minute, looking speculatively at the comic books. At the soda fountain, a woman was drinking a big chocolate soda. The sight of it made Babur's mouth water. That settled it. He turned and continued on his way, even increasing his pace a little. Now, this passage shifts to a lighter tone, describing a typical day for Babur. The warmth and sunshine contrast with the darker emotion of the previous scenes, giving a brief respite. Babur's attraction to comic books and the chocolate soda is typical for a young boy, and the simple pleasure that he has. However, the mention that this settled it and led him to continue on his way suggests that he has decided to go ahead with his final visit to Mrs. Drew, even though he's tempted by other distractions. Next line. A few minutes later, he came upon the grey, sagging porch and rang the bell. Below him, the weeds blew and rustled with wind. It was almost 4 o'clock. He could not stay too long, but then it was the last time anyhow. Bobber's return to Mrs. Drew's house is marked by a sense of finality. The grey sagging porch and the weeds blew and rustled the wind reinforce the atmosphere of decay and neglect. The mention of time, it was almost 4 o'clock and he could not stay too long, creates a sense of urgency, friends, reminding us that this is his last visit. Also, the phrase, but then it was the last time anyhow, underscores the bittersweet nature of this moment. The door opened. Mrs. Drew's wrinkled face broke into smiles. Come in, Bernard. It's good to see you standing there. It makes me feel so young again to have you come visit. Mrs. Drew's reaction to seeing Bubber is joyful but also tinged with melancholy. Her wrinkled face broke into smile, showing how much his visit means to her. Her comment, it makes me feel so young again, hints at the magical transformation we have seen before, but also serves as a reminder of how fleeting this feeling of youth is for her. He went inside, looking around. This simple action of Bobber looking around might suggest that he is taking in the surroundings for the last time. It's a quiet moment of observation, perhaps filled with unspoken thoughts and emotions. I'll start the cookies. I didn't know if you were coming. She padded into the kitchen. I'll get them started right away. You sit down on the couch. Mrs. Drew's response is eager, yet there's an undercurrent of sadness in her words. The fact that she did not understand if he was coming reveals the anxiety and uncertainty about whether Bubber would return or not. Her immediate action to start the cookies suggests that she is trying to recapture the warmth and comfort that the routine has provided, but there's a hint of desperation. She's trying to hold on to something fleeting. Next line. Bubber went over and sat down. He noticed that the table and lamp were gone. The chair was right up next to the couch. He was looking at the chair in perplexity when Mrs. Drew came rustling back into the room. Friends, the table and lamp were absent. So, the absence of table and lamp and the proximity of the chair to the couch are subtle but significant details. They indicate that Mrs. Drew has been preparing for this visit, perhaps in a way that reflects her growing attachment to Bubber. The chair being closer suggests her desire to be nearer to him physically and emotionally. Bubber's perplexity shows that he is noticing these changes, even if he doesn't fully understand their significance. During the oven, I had the batter all ready now. She sat down in the chair with a sigh. Well, how did it go today? How was school? Mrs. Drew's attempt at small talk about school is continuation of her efforts to engage with Bubber, to make his visit last as long as possible. The fact that she had the batter all ready implies that she was hopeful and perhaps even anxiously awaiting his arrival. Her sigh as she sits down suggests relief but also a deep weariness. This visit might be more emotionally taxing than the previous ones, knowing it could be the last. Fine. Bubber's response is once again brief and indifferent. He doesn't share Mrs. Drew's emotional investment in these visits, which creates a poignant contrast between them. His simplicity and lack of awareness about the depth of her feelings highlight the gap between their perspectives. She nodded. How plump he was, the little boy sitting just a little distance from her, his cheeks red and full. She could touch him. He was so close. Her aged heart thumped. Ah, to be young again. Youth was so much. It was everything. What did the world mean to the old? When all the world is old, lad. Now, friends, Mrs. Drew's thoughts here are a mix of admiration and envy. She notices Bubber's plumpness and youth, which stand in stark contrast to her own frailty and age. Her aged heart thumped suggests a rush of emotion, possibly even a physical response to being near to something so full of life. Her internal monologue reveals her longing for youth and the incomplete thought, when all the world is old, lad, suggests a realization of the inevitability of aging, yet a desire to cling to youth when she can. Do you want to read me, Bernard? She asks presently. Mrs. Dew's request is a return to their usual routine, but there's an urgency to it now. She's trying to recreate the moment that have brought her such comfort and fleeting youthfulness. The use of presently indicates a pause as if she's gathering the courage to ask, knowing this might be one of the last times. I did not bring any books. Bobber's response is another small but significant break from their routine. By not bringing his books, he is signaling that he did not plan on staying long, or perhaps that he is already mentally detached from their visits. It's a subtle reminder that for Bubber, these visits are less meaningful than they are for Mrs. Drew. Oh, she nodded. Well, I have some books, she said quickly. I'll get them. Mrs. Drew's quick response shows a determination to keep the visits going to maintain her connection even if Bubber didn't bring his books. His eagerness to provide a book herself is another sign of how much she relies on these moments of connection, how desperately she clings to the routine that brings her some semblance of life and youth. She got up, crossing to the bookcase. As she opened the doors, Bubber said, Mrs. Drew, my father says I can't come here anymore. He says this is the last time. I thought I'd tell you. Now, friends, this is the moment of truth where Bubber delivers a news that Mrs. Drew has been dreading. The way he states it almost casually highlights the emotional distance between them. For Bubber, it's just something that he needs to inform her about. But for Mrs. Drew, it's a devastating blow. The fact that he says, I thought I would tell you, shows that he's aware it's important but doesn't grasp the full impact of his words will have. She stopped, standing rigid. Everything seemed to leap around her, the room twisting furiously. She took a harsh, frightened breath. Bernard, you're not coming back? Mrs. Drew's reaction is immediate and intense. The world around her, twisting furiously, is a metaphor for her internal turmoil. The shock and fear of losing Bubber, of being left alone again. Her stammering question reveals her desperation, her need for confirmation of what she already fears. No, my father says not to. Bubber's response is straightforward and final. There's no room for negotiation, and the simplicity of his statement contrasts with the emotional chaos it causes Mrs. Drew. His father's authority is absolute in his life, and he doesn't question it. There was silence. The old lady took a book at random and came slowly back to her chair. After a while, she passed the book to him, her hands trembling. The boy took it without expression, looking at its cover. The silence that follows Bubber's statement is heavy with unspoken emotion. Mrs. Drew's slow, trembling movements show how deeply she's affected. She's trying to maintain the routine, but it's clear that the news has shaken her to her core. Her choice of books at random reflects her disorientation. She is no longer focused on the content, just on preserving the connection for as long as possible. Bobber's lack of expression as he takes the book highlights the gulf between them. He doesn't understand the significance of this moment for Mrs. Drew. Please read, Bernard, please. Mrs. Drew's plea is heartbreaking in its simplicity. The repetition of please shows her desperation to hold on to this moment, to prolong the last bit of connection she has with Bobber. It's not just about reading. It's about clinging to the life and youth his presence brings her. All right, he opened the book. Where'll I start? Bobber's agreement is given without much thought, again showing how little he understands the depth of Mrs. Drew's emotions. His question, where'll I start, is almost perfunctory, another sign that he's just going through the motions without realizing the significance of this last reading session. Anywhere, anywhere, Bernard. Mrs. Drew's response, anywhere, reflects her desperation. It doesn't matter what he reads, what matters is the act of reading, the sound of his voice, the presence of youth and life. She, um, she's grasping at anything that will keep him there, even if it's only for a few or more minutes. He began to read. It was something by Trollope. She only half heard the words. She put her hand to her forehead, the dry skin brittle and thin like old paper. She trembled with anguish. The last time? Now, friends, as Bobber reads, the content becomes secondary to Mrs. Drew's emotional state. The mention of Trollope, a classic author, might suggest something grand and meaningful, but Mrs. Drew can barely focus on the words. Her comparison of her skin to old paper is a powerful image of frailty and decay. Her trembling and the question, the last time, emphasize her overwhelming sorrow and fear of returning to a life of loneliness and aging without Bubber's revitalizing presence. Bubber read on, slowly, monotonously. Against the window, a fly buzzed. Outside, the sun began to set, the air turning cool. A few clouds came up, and the wind in the trees rushed furiously. The atmosphere in this passage mirrors the emotional tone. Bubber's slow, monotonous reading contrasts with the increasing tension in the environment. The buzzing fly and the setting sun symbolizes passing of time and the inevitability of the ending. The rushing wind adds a sense of impending change or loss, reflecting the emotional storm brewing inside Mrs. Drew. The old lady sat close by the boy, closer than ever, hearing him read, the sound of his voice, sensing him close by. Was this really the last time? Terror rose up in her heart and she pushed it back. The last time, she gazed at him, the boy sitting so close to her. After a time, she reached out her thin, dry hand. She took a deep breath. He would never be back. There would be no more times. No more. This was the last time he would sit there. The physical closeness between Mrs. Drew and Bubber during his final reading session is poignant reflection of her emotional need. She draws nearer to him, as if trying to absorb every bit of his presence. The repetition of the last time in Mrs. Drew's thoughts underscores the gravity of the moment. It's as if she's trying to internalize the reality that this is it. This is the final time she will experience the warmth and vitality that Bubber brings into her life. Her reaching out with her thin, dry hand is a desperate attempt to grasp what she knows is slipping away. The physical act of touching him is her last connection to youth and life that she yearns for. Next line. She touched his arm. Bubber looked up. What is it? He murmured. The simplicity of this exchange is powerful. Mrs. Drew's touch is laden with meaning, a final, almost sacred moment for her. Bubber's response, however, is casual and indifferent. He's unaware of the emotional significance behind her gesture. This contrast highlights the different realities of the two characters that are living. For Mrs. Drew, this is the moment of profound connection and loss, and for Bubber, it's just another day. You don't mind if I touch your arm, do you? No, I guess not. He went on reading. Mrs. Drew's question is almost pleading, as if she's seeking permission to hold on to the last bit of life she feels through Bubber. Her asking for permission to touch him further emphasizes her vulnerability and importance of this small connection. Bubber's nonchalant response, no, I guess not, and his immediate return to reading again shows his detachment. He doesn't realize the depth of Mrs. Drew's need. The old lady could feel the youngness of him flowing between her fingers through her arm. A pulsating, vibrating youngness, so close to her. It had never been that close where she could actually touch it. The feel of life made her dizzy, unsteady. Here, the story intensifies the magical realism element. Mrs. Drew is not just touching Bubber, she's absorbing the essence of his youth. The description of the pulsating, vibrating youngness flowing into her emphasizes how vital this connection is for her. It's as if she's drawing life itself from her, which gives her a dizzying sense of vitality that she hasn't felt in years. This moment encapsulates her deep longing to escape the confines of her aged body. Next line. And presently it began to happen as before. She closed her eyes, letting it move over her, filling her up, carried into her by the sound of the voice and the feel of the arm. The change, the flow, was coming over, the warm rising feeling. She was blooming again, filling with life, swelling into richness as she had been once long ago. The transformation that Mrs. Drew experiences is described almost in sensual terms. The warm rising feeling and the swelling into richness creates a vivid image of her regaining her youth and vitality. The use of the word blooming suggests that she is not just regaining her youth, but flourishing, becoming something beautiful and full of life once again. This moment is both exhilarating and tragic because we know it is fleeting. She looked down at her arms, rounded they were, and the nails clear. Her hair black again, heavy and black against her neck. She touched her cheek. The wrinkles had gone, the skin plain and soft. Mrs. Drew's physical transformation is complete. Her arms are rounded, her hair is thick and black again, and her skin is smooth and soft, free from wrinkles. These descriptions paint a picture of a woman who has returned to her prime, to the version of herself that she almost likely cherished the most. The transformation is what she has been yearning for, and now in Bubber's presence, she is able to reclaim it, even if just for a moment. Joy filled her, a growing, bursting joy. She stared around her at the room. She smiled, feeling her firm teeth and gums, red lips, strong white teeth. Suddenly, she got to her feet, her body secure and confident. She turned a little lithe, quick circle. The joy that Mrs. Drew feels is overwhelming. It is as if she has been reborn, experiencing the world with the energy and confidence of her younger self. The act of getting to her feet and turning in a lithe, quick circle symbolizes her newfound vitality and freedom. She is no longer bound by the frailty of old age, but is instead full of life and movement. This moment is triumphant for her, but it's also fleeting, which adds to the poignancy of the scene. Bubber stopped reading. Are the cookies ready? He said. The spell is broken as Bauer interrupts Mrs. Drew's moment of joy with a mundane question about cookies. This intrusion of reality into her moment of fantasy highlights the temporary nature of her transformation. Bubber's focus on the cookies show that while Mrs. Drew has been experiencing a profound moment of renewal, he remains unaware and disconnected, concerned only with the immediate, tangible reward of cookies. I'll see. Her voice was alive, deep with a quality that had dried out many years before. Now it was there again, her voice throaty and sensual. She walked quickly to the kitchen and opened the oven. She took out the cookies and put them on the top of the stove. Now, friends, Mrs. Drew's voice, now alive and deep, reflects her complete transformation. It's as if her very essence has been rejuvenated, not just physically but also in spirit. The description of her voice as throaty and sensual indicates that she feels a connection to her younger, more vital self. She moves with a newfound energy as she retrieves the cookie, demonstrating how deeply Bubber's presence has affected her. Already, she called gaily. Come and get them. Mrs. Drew's gaiety, as she calls out to Bubber, is stark contrast of the earlier scene of her frailty and loneliness. She's brimming with life, almost childlike in her excitement. The moment is pure, unadulterated joy for her, a joy that is directly linked to the presence of Bubber and the transformation he brings about. Bubber came past her, his gaze fastened on the sight of the cookies. He did not even notice the woman by the door. This line highlights the disconnect between Bubber and Mrs. Drew. While she is experiencing an intense personal transformation, Bubber is completely oblivious, focused solely on the cookies. His lack of awareness underscores the tragedy of Mrs. Drew's situation. Her profound experience is invisible and unimportant to the only person who can trigger it. Next line. Mrs. Drew hurried from the kitchen. She went into the bedroom, closing the door after her. Then she turned, gazing into the full length mirror on the door. Young she was, again filled out with the sap of vigorous youth. She took a deep breath, her steady bosom swelling. Her eyes flashed. She smiled. She spun, her skirts flying. Young and lovely, and this time it had not gone away. Mrs. Drew's actions here are those of a woman who has just rediscovered herself. She hurries to the bedroom to see her reflection, to confirm that the transformation is real and lasting. The description of her as filled out with the sap of vigorous youth is a vivid image of life and vitality, something she had long lost. Her deep breath and swelling of her bosom are symbolic of her feeling alive again, as if she is breathing in life itself. The spinning with her skirts flying is a celebration of her regained youth and beauty. The phrase, and this time it has not gone away, is crucial. It suggests that she believes this transformation might be permanent, that she can hold on to this youth and vitality. Next line. She opened the door. Bobber had filled his mouth and his pockets. He was standing in the center of the living room, his face fat and dull, a dead white. The scene shifts back to Bubber, who is oblivious to the transformation of Mrs. Drew and all that she has experienced. His face fat and dull, described here in the story, contrasts sharply with Mrs. Drew's vibrant new appearance. This description of Bubber also introduces a sense of foreboding. There's something unsettling about his appearance, as if the transfer of life from him to Mrs. Drew has taken a toll on him. What's the matter? Mrs. Drew said. Mrs. Drew's question reflects her concern but also her detachment from Bubber's reality. She's so caught up in her own transformation that she doesn't immediately notice that something might be wrong with him. I am going. All right, Bernard, and thanks for coming to read me. She laid her hands on his shoulder. Perhaps I'll see you again sometime. Bubber's decision to leave is abrupt, signaling the end of their interaction and symbolically the end of Mrs. Drew's temporary reprieve from old age. Mrs. Drew's gratitude and her hopefulness in saying, "Perhaps I'll see you again sometime," show that she is still clinging to the possibility of future visits, despite knowing deep down that this was likely the last one. Her laying a hand on the shoulder is a final tender gesture trying to hold on to the connection for just a moment longer. My father. I know. She laughed gaily, opening the door for him. Goodbye, Bernard. Goodbye. Bubber's attempt to explain that he might not be back is cut off by Mrs. Drew's laugh. Her laughter, described as gaily, is almost an act of denial, a way of brushing aside the reality that this might be the last interaction. By laughing and opening the door for him, she is trying to maintain the illusion of normalcy, to hold on to the joy and youth she feels for just a little longer. The repetition of "Goodbye, Bernard, goodbye" is poignant. She's saying goodbye not just to Bubber but the youth and vitality he temporarily brought back into her life. She watched him go down the steps one at a time. Then she closed the door and skipped back into the bedroom. She unfastened her dress and stepped out of it. The worn grey fabric suddenly distasteful to her. For a brief second, she gazed at her full, rounded body, her hands on her hips. The contrast here is striking. Mrs. Drew watches Bubber leave, and her movements are described as skipped, reflecting the youthful energy she feels. She is fully embracing her transformation now, shredding her old, worn dress as if discarding the remnants of her former aged self. Her action of gazing at her body, particularly her full and rounded figure, is filled with a sense of pride and rediscovery. She's reveling in her newfound youth, in the physical vitality that she thought was lost forever. Next lines. She laughed with excitement, turning a little, her eyes bright. What a wonderful body, bursting with life. A swelling breast, she touched herself. The flesh was firm. There was so much, so many things to do. She gazed about her, breathing quickly. So many things. She started the water running in the bathtub and then went to tie her hair up. Now, friends, Mrs. Drew's excitement is almost palpable. The language used here is bursting with life, swelling breast, flesh was firm, all emphasize her physical rejuvenation. She's rediscovering herself, her desires, and her dreams. The idea that there was so much, so many things to do suggests a newfound purpose and a zest of life. The act of preparing a bath and tying her hair up can be seen as symbolic of her readiness to fully embrace this new chapter, to cleanse herself of the past and step into this youthful version of herself. The wind blew around him as he trudged home. It was late. The sun had set, and the sky overhead was dark and cloudy. The wind that blew and nudged against him was cold, and it penetrated through his clothing, chilling him. The boy felt tired. His head ached. He stopped every few minutes, rubbing his forehead and resting. His heart laboring. He left Elm Street and went up Pine Street. The wind screeched around him, pushing him from side to side. He shook his head, trying to clear it. How weary he was, how tired his arms and legs were. He felt the wind hammering at him, pushing and plucking at him. This passage shifts back to Bubber, and the tone is starkly different from the scene with Mrs. Drew. The wind, described as cold and penetrating, adds to the sense of discomfort and exhaustion that Bubber is experiencing. The imagery here is dark skies, cold wind. This creates a foreboding atmosphere, suggesting that something is definitely wrong. Bubber's physical state, tired, headache, heart laboring, is alarming. It's as if life and energy that Mrs. Drew gained have been drained from him. His struggles against the wind mirrors his internal struggle, perhaps against the very process that has rejuvenated Mrs. Drew. He took a breath and went on, his head down. At the corner, he stopped, holding on to a lamppost. The sky was quite dark. The street lights were beginning to come on. At last, he went on, walking as best as he could. Friends, Bubber's struggle continues as he had to hold on to a lamppost for his support. Now, this just shows how weak he had become. The darkness closing in and streetlights beginning to come on add to the eerie atmosphere, creating a sense of dread. Bubber is depicted as barely managing to keep going, and the reader is left to wonder what exactly has happened to him, whether the toll of these visits has finally caught up with him. Where is that boy? May Searle said, going out on the porch for the 10th time. Ralph flicked on the light and they stood together. What an awful wind. Back at Bubber's home, May's concern is evident as she reportedly checks for him. Her impatience and worry are conveyed through her repeated trips to the porch. The mention of the awful wind continues the motif of cold, harsh environment that Bubber is struggling against. It also creates a sense of urgency and tension. Something is clearly wrong, and the wind serves as a metaphorical and literal force working against Bubber. The wind whistled and lashed at the porch. The two of them looked up and down the dark street, but they could see nothing but a few newspapers and trash being blown along. Now, friends, you can imagine the situation here. The imagery reinforces the desolate and foreboding atmosphere. The whistling and lashing wind are aggressive, almost malevolent forces. The fact that May and Ralph can't see anything but newspaper and trash heightens the sense of unease. Bubber is out there somewhere, but he's not yet visible, adding to the growing tension. Let's go inside, Ralph said. He sure is going to get a licking when he gets back home. Ralph's comment reflects the disciplinary approach he intends to take, showing that he's more focused on the consequences for Bubber than on his own well being at this moment. His casual mention of punishment contrasts with the serious concern May seems to be feeling, suggesting a disconnect between their perspectives. Ralph's words might also be an attempt to mask his own worry with a display of authority. Next line. They sat down at the dinner table. Presently, May put down her fork. Listen, do you hear something? Now, friends, this scene at the dinner table with May putting down a fork builds suspense. The action of putting down the fork, usually a sign of pausing to listen or because of distraction, signals that something unusual is going to happen. May's question, do you hear something, indicates that she's picking up on a sound that doesn't belong, increasing tension. Now, here, if you go to the next line, it says, Ralph listened. Outside against the front door, there was a faint sound, a tapping sound. He stood up. The wind howled outside, blowing the shades in the room upstairs. I'll go see what it is, he said. The faint tapping sound at the door is eerie and unsettling, especially against the backdrop of howling wind. It's a sound that doesn't quite fit with the natural elements, suggesting something unnatural or ominous. Now, Ralph's decision to investigate adds to the suspense. What could this faint sound be? The howling and blowing shades add to the haunted atmosphere, making the reader anticipate something dreadful. Next line. He went on to the door and opened it. Something grey, something grey and dry was blowing up against the porch, carried by the wind. He stared at it, but he could not make it out. A bundle of weeds and rags blown by the wind, perhaps. Now, the description of something grey and dry blowing against the porch is both mysterious and chilling. The imagery evokes something lifeless and desiccated, like the remnants of something once alive. Ralph's inability to make it out adds to the mystery and unease. He's seeing something out of ordinary, something that defies immediate recognition. The comparison to a bundle of weeds and rags hints at something that's been discarded or left to decay, enhancing the eerie tone. Next line. The bundle bounced against his legs. He watched it drift past him against the wall of the house. Then he closed the door again slowly. Now, friends, this moment is surreal and unsettling. The bundle bouncing against his legs gives it a strange, almost ghostly life, as if it's trying to make contact or communicate something. The fact that Ralph watches it drift past him and then closes the door slowly suggests that he's disturbed by what he sees, but unsure of what to make of it. There's a sense of um, unreality to the moment, as if something from the world of the dead has momentarily crossed into the living world. What was it? May call. Just the Ralph sir said. Ralph's dismissal, just the wind, is likely an attempt to rationalize what he's just seen. However, his response doesn't match the eerie nature of the encounter, suggesting that he's either in denial or trying to avoid alarming May. The reader, however, is left with a lingering sense of unease, knowing that what Ralph saw was something far more than ominous than he's willing to admit. So, friends, this is the end of the story. I would say the spooky story. And as we realize, the story ends with an ambiguous and an eerie note, leaving the reader with a sense of unresolved tensions. Mrs. Drew's transformation, Bubber's deterioration, and the strange lifeless bundle all suggest that something supernatural or inexplicable has occurred, but the exact nature of it is left to the reader's imagination. This open endedness contributes to the haunting quality of the story, allowing the eerie atmosphere to linger along after the final lines. The ambiguity leaves room for various interpretations, heightening the sense of unease and mystery. Has Mrs. Drew, in her desperate desire to reclaim youth, somehow drained the life from Bubber? Or is it the transformation merely a reflection of her inner fantasies, with the eerie events hinting at a darker supernatural exchange? The closing scene, friends, with Ralph dismissing the strange occurrence as just the wind, adds to the chilling effect. It's a rational explanation that fails to account for the unsettling details we have witnessed, making it clear that something far more mysterious and possibly malevolent has transpired. The fact that Ralph and May return to their normal routine, unaware of the full gravity of the situation, leaves the reader with a lingering sense of dread and unsettling feeling that what we've witnessed is just the surface of deeper, more disturbing truth. In essence, friends, this story masterfully combines the element of horror, loneliness, and the human yearning for lost youth, creating a narrative that is both haunting and deeply poignant. The final image of the wind blowing the shades and mysterious bundle underscores the idea that some forces, like time and mortality, cannot be escaped or fully understood, leaving us with a story that continues to resonate and disturb long after it ends. All right. Thank you, friends, for joining me on this journey through the story. I hope this detailed exploration has given you a deeper understanding and appreciation for the narrative's intricacies. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more in depth analysis and discussions. Now, friends, you're already aware that your support helps keep this channel growing, and I'm excited to bring you more content that makes learning enjoyable and enlightening. Until next time, keep exploring the world of literature with curiosity and passion. See you in the next video.